We are all excited about the Sacramento Kings starting five next season, but their bench depth is significantly improved as well. But how good is the Kings bench compared to benches around the rest of the league? We'll take a look at that and talk about the difference between bench depth and injury depth on today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time. Time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off-season. My name is Matt George. I have the privilege of being your host here. I'm a Sacramento sports reporter and producer at ABC 10 News here in the California capital. I'm currently in our sports office here at ABC 10, and if you're watching on YouTube, one of our lights isn't working. That's why the lighting is so dark, and it might look like a closet in the background. I actually have some Kings film going on behind me. I think Kings in Oklahoma City that I thought would be a good backdrop as well. But this is not going to be the first or last time that you see the Locked On Kings podcast done here at the ABC 10 studios, especially when we get into the regular season. I'm going to be doing a lot of podcasts from the Golden One Center. I'm going to be doing a lot of post-game pods here from the studio, so maybe get used to the chaotic background that you see behind me that I try and get work done in. Of course, I'll still be doing stuff at the at-home studio as well, but you don't care about that. You care about Sacramento Kings content. Now that we're in September, that means training camps are on the horizon. Great training camp battles on the horizon as well. I still have a great series coming up where I'm going to partner with Brendan Nunez from Kings Pulse to look at and break down some of these position battles. And you might debate what we're going to talk about today, talking about the Kings bench unit. I have names on this Kings bench that potentially could be in the starting lineup. I put this Kings bench lineup together based off of what I believe the bench will be and what the starters will be on opening night. Again, just my opinion. Your opinion might differ, and that's what training camp is going to decide a lot of. And Brendan, again, is going to join me for that. Speaking of Brendan Nunez, he, over at Kings Pulse, has been doing a phenomenal job covering the Kings players playing internationally in FIBA. He has, like, Domantas Sabonis and all the work that he's doing. I think Sabonis lost to Luka Doncic today. You have Chimezi Metu, who is, I think, leading Nigeria in scoring, Nemias Keita, and what he's doing for Portugal. Brendan has all of this broken down on Kings Pulse, and if you follow him on social media, you'll see all the breakdowns there as well. I was considering attempting to do something like that on Locked On Kings, but it would just be stealing and taking a lot of information that Brendan provides. So I encourage you go and check out the work that Brendan is doing. He's a friend of the show, a close friend of mine. I think he's doing phenomenal work, and I wanted to make sure to shout that out here at the beginning of this podcast so you are up to date on everything that's going on with the Kings in FIBA. But as for this upcoming season, how much better is this Sacramento Kings bench, and how does this Kings bench stack up with the rest of the league? Well, I put together the bench five. Now, I believe personally the Kings are going to have a 9-man rotation. I don't think it's going to be a 10-man rotation, but what I did is I took essentially who I believe the backup is going to be, if this were a depth chart, the backup at every single position. I put that five together, wrote their averages from last season down, not their career averages, but their averages from last season. It's what they've been able to do most recently. I wrote all those down, and then I went roster by roster through the rest of the league, and I compared the Kings bench to opposing benches. And what I came up with, in my personal opinion, based off of numbers and just based off of like the eye test and what I believe from different players around the league, the Kings are almost smack dab in the middle in terms of bench, in my opinion. Now, this is the bench five that I have for the Kings. I have Donovan Mitchell as the backup point guard. I have Malik Monk as the backup shooting guard. He could be the starter. I have Kent Bazemore as the backup 3, the small forward. I have Trey Lyles as the backup 4, assuming Keegan Murray is starting right away. And I have Rashawn Holmes as the backup 5. Now, it very well could be only 4 of those 5 guys get consistent rotation time. But Donovan Mitchell averages or averaged last season 11.5 points per game, shot 41% from the field, 31% from three-point range, also averaged 4 assists. Malik Monk averaged 13.8 points per game and 3 rebounds. Kent Bazemore averaged just 3 points per game in his time with the Los Angeles Lakers last season, rarely played. Trey Lyles averaged 10.6 points with the Sacramento Kings last season after the trade deadline, and Rashawn Holmes added 10.4 points. So you look at that and you see 4 out of the 5 guys on the Kings bench last season averaged double digits in scoring. That's significant for the Kings. Now, in the case of Trey Lyles, he was a starter in his time with Sacramento. So will he get as much minutes or as many minutes and have the opportunity for that much production? That'll be up in the air. Rashawn Holmes will have significantly reduced minutes over the course of the season because he's going to be playing behind Domantas Sabonis, or maybe we'll get looks of the two of them on the floor together. Is he able to average double digits in scoring? I expect Davion Mitchell to average double digits and get 25-plus minutes a night. I expect Malik Monk to average double digits and maybe go up from last season. Last season's 13 points, nearly 14 points per game, was a career high for him. So I expect that to continue. I expect that to increase. So the Kings have a lot of scoring power off of their bench. There's questions about defense, just like there's questions about defense across this entire roster, although with Davion Mitchell leading that second unit and playing what I believe is going to be the primary 6-man role alongside Malik Monk defensively, I expect the Kings to be better off for that. So I took that 5 and I compared them to different rosters, right? I said the Kings are smack down in the middle for a reason. I have 15 teams that have a better bench unit, in my opinion, than the Kings, and 14 teams that have a worse bench unit. I'll start with the teams that I believe are better, and these are completely up for debate. You can go through and look through these. There might be some on here that you are like, really? You think that bench unit is better than the Kings? But again, these are based off of numbers and based off of my own opinion of the unit as a whole, not just the individual players. Here are the teams that I think the Kings have a worse bench than. The Boston Celtics, Brooklyn Nets, Charlotte Hornets, Chicago Bulls, Cleveland Cavaliers, especially now that they acquired Donovan Mitchell, and we'll talk about that trade at the end that just dropped. The Denver Nuggets, the Golden State Warriors, LA Clippers, and let me clarify, Donovan Mitchell's not going to be a bench player in Cleveland, but they did have to trade away some of their depth to get Donovan, so I might actually have to reevaluate this to see if Cleveland's bench is still going to be pretty good once we know the full details of that trade. Golden State Warriors, I expect their bench to be better than the Kings. LA Clippers, Miami Heat, Milwaukee Bucks, New York Knicks, Orlando Magic. That one I went back and forth on, but I ultimately think that Orlando's bench is a little bit better than the Sacramento Kings. I could be wrong there. That's up for debate. Philadelphia 76ers, Phoenix Suns, and Washington Wizards. Those are the teams, the 15 teams that I think have a better bench than the Kings. Here are the teams that I think have a worse bench than the Kings. The Atlanta Hawks, Dallas Mavericks, Detroit Pistons, Houston Rockets, Indiana Pacers, LA Lakers, Memphis Grizzlies. That one was a tough one. Memphis' starting 5 is really, really good. Not too impressed with their depth, but I could be wrong there. Minnesota Timberwolves, New Orleans Pelicans, Oklahoma City Thunder, Portland Trail Blazers, San Antonio Spurs, Toronto Raptors, and Utah Jazz, especially now that the Utah Jazz have just completely gutted their roster. So I personally think the Kings bench is right in the middle of the pack, which is fine. Now, there's a difference between having good bench depth, which I think the Sacramento Kings do have, and having good injury depth. And I'm going to touch on that in the next segment. But when I look at this Kings bench, I see offensive firepower. I see the potential defensively for them to at least meet the status quo, right? And I think that's what we're asking across the board for the Kings defensively. Just be average. Just meet the status quo. But what I see from this Kings bench that is significant compared to years past is I see a group who I believe is going to be able to mainly pick up the slack or continue what the starters are doing well. Do I expect this Kings bench to be able to bail the starters out if they get off to a really bad start? I think that can happen from time to time. I don't think you can rely on the Kings bench to do that. If you could, they'd be one of the best benches in the NBA, right? And there are certainly players on this bench that I think can make a case for getting closing lineup minutes. And like Davion Mitchell might be a closing lineup player. Malik Monk might be a closing lineup player. Hell, Rashawn Holmes could find a way to work himself into being a closing lineup player. That's significant as well. But I think overall, if the Kings get off to a good start, let's put it this way. De'Aaron Fox, one of the fastest, if not the fastest point guard in the league. It sounds like, based off of what we've heard Mike Brown say, it sounds like the Kings are going to offensively have an emphasis on running up and down the floor, playing with pace, right? And a lot of pace comes from better defensive stops, getting defensive rebounds, forcing steals, forcing turnovers, things like that, blocking shots. If the Kings are able to get out and transition, establish themselves in the fast break in the first 8 to 9 minutes of the game, or maybe the first quarter, maybe De'Aaron plays the first 11, 12 minutes of the game, then comes out to start the second quarter. I think Donovan Mitchell is capable of coming in and continuing to play with that pace and continuing to run the offense the same way that De'Aaron has. Think about it in years past, right? Corey Joseph is a perfect example. I was a fan of Corey Joseph, more the player or person than the player. I liked Corey a lot. He kind of got a bad rap here in Sacramento and wasn't the most popular player here in Sacramento. Despite what he would say in interviews from time to time, when De'Aaron would come out of the game and Corey Joseph would come into the game, things significantly slowed down, right? The Kings became a half-court offensive team. Remember when De'Aaron Fox got hurt the first season that Corey Joseph was here in Sacramento? De'Aaron got hurt, and for about 2 weeks, the Kings played around 500 basketball, but they were suddenly a half-court team. I thought Corey Joseph did a pretty good job filling in for the best player on the team. Of course, he can't replace De'Aaron Fox by any means, but the Kings had to change their style of play based off of the lineups that were on the floor. That is something that we've seen consistently throughout this playoff drought, that the Kings, depending upon who's on the floor, they would have to change the way that they play. And it made it difficult because a lot of times the Kings would also change the way that they played against each opponent. They would almost try to match how their opponents were playing versus playing their own game, and their depth kind of fed more into that than into how they wanted to play the game. I look at that differently this year. I see a team that is going to be able to continue what the starters have started or built, right? Whether it's playing with fast pace and running the offense like De'Aaron Fox is able to, playing through a big man in the pick and roll. Rashawn Holmes can potentially come in and do that when Domantas Sabonis is out. It's spacing the floor, having Trey Lyles maybe out there who can space the floor when Keegan Murray is out of the game. Or, I mean, if anything, Kent Bazemore, hopefully, I'm not expecting him to replace or put up the same numbers that Harrison Barnes is capable of putting up. But Kent Bazemore, I think, can come in, and like we saw in his limited time with the Sacramento Kings a couple of seasons ago, Kent Bazemore can come in and effectively play, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Malik Monk can come in and probably score better than Kevin Huerter can. Maybe. I don't know. I expect Kevin Huerter to have a bigger scoring role here in Sacramento than he did with the Atlanta Hawks. And for his career, he's around a 12 points per game scorer. Can he get that number up to 15? I think Malik Monk is very capable of averaging 15 points in 20-plus minutes coming off the bench. And I think he will get that. So I see a team that is going to be able to run a pick and roll, attack the rim, kick out a lot of three-point shooters style offense, fast break as well, throughout the entire 48 minutes, regardless of who's in the game. Now, of course, I think De'Aaron's going to be able to run it more effectively than Davion, just because De'Aaron is the star of this team. Sabonis is going to be more effective in the pick and roll and more effective as a distributor compared to a Rashawn Holmes. But when you have guys out there like a Keegan Murray, like a Malik Monk, like a Kevin Huerter, like a Harrison Barnes, these are guys that can fluctuate and adapt their games to players who are out. And if they need to take a bigger role, like Keegan Murray is going to get opportunities. I think as a starter, when he's playing with Fox and Sabonis a lot, he's going to have more of a kind of in the background role, which I think he will thrive in. But then when one of the two of them or both of them are out of the game and Keegan Murray is still on the floor, maybe he takes over and gets more of a predominant scoring role like what we saw in Summer League or what we saw in his time at Iowa. So I'm very excited to see this depth in action. But again, there's a difference between bench depth and injury depth. I'll touch on that after I tell you about a great sponsor here of the Locked On Kings podcast. I'm talking, of course, about Bet Online. And as we gear up for the start of the season, preseason schedules are coming out. Bet Online is the absolute best place for you to bet on all of your sports gambling and get all your sports gambling needs, from incredibly fun regular game lines, the best game lines that you will find, point spreads, things of that nature, to fun prop bets and future bets. Like you can bet on whether or not you think the Kings will break their win total, which is, I think the over-under was at like 34 games. I certainly would take the over on that for the Sacramento Kings this year. It's an incredibly fun place to get all your sports gambling done. And on top top of that, it's not just basketball. They have MLB, they have NHL, NFL betting really starting to pick up here now that we're done with preseason and the regular season is starting next week. And they have all the stuff for combat sports that you can need, boxing, MMA. If you're a golf person, they have betting for that. Soccer, they have stuff for that as well. Make sure betonline.net is the place that you are going to do all of your sports gambling. They've been such a phenomenal partner here of the Locked On Kings podcast for the last few years. BetOnline, where the game starts. Bench depth is great, and the Sacramento Kings have that. Injury depth is a completely different story, and there are very, very few teams in this league that have really good injury depth. I think the Kings have solid injury depth. And what I mean by that is, in the event that, knock on all the wood around me, if Keegan Murray gets hurt, I think Trey Lyles is capable of coming in and to some extent filling that role. If Harrison Barnes gets hurt, maybe you move Keegan Murray up to the 3 spot. He can fill that role. If Kevin Huerter gets hurt or Malik Monk gets hurt, the other can step into that scoring role as a 2 guard. If Domantas Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox get hurt, the Kings are in a world of trouble. The difference between bench depth and injury depth is if Domantas Sabonis or De'Aaron Fox get into early foul trouble, Davion can come in and pick up the slack a little bit. Rashawn can come in and pick up the slack for Sabonis. You've heard me say before, I don't think it is a plummet off a cliff drop-off from Sabonis to Rashawn Holmes or from De'Aaron to Davion. Now, it's not the same. If the Kings have to go a month without one or both of those guys, they're in trouble, right? And there's most teams in the league that would not be able to survive a month of losing one of their top guys unless they have another star on their roster who's capable of carrying that load. And while I think De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis are going to be an elite duo for the Sacramento Kings this year, I genuinely think the Kings are going to be feared when it comes to that pick and roll combination. I think there are going to be a lot of defenses around the league that really struggle and scratch their head wondering what the heck to do against those two, especially with so many shooters around them. I really, truly believe that. Defensively, it's another question. I think offensively, the Kings are going to be a top 10 offensive team this year. Now, is the defense going to be good enough for that to actually mean something in terms of wins? We'll have to wait and see with that. But as good as Sabonis is, as good as Fox is individually, if one of the two of them goes down, I don't know how much you can lean on the other to really pick up that slack. As a unit, cohesively, if different guys step up consistently on a nightly basis, not just one guy, but 2 or 3 guys step up, maybe the Kings can overcome that. But that's asking a lot from a team that doesn't have that winning experience yet. That's something the Golden State Warriors can get away with. The Boston Celtics can get away with, not the Sacramento Kings. So injury depth-wise, the Kings have enough to, I think, survive, which honestly you might own. That might be the best that you can ask of any team in the league when a star goes down. But I'm not, when I look at the Kings' depth and I'm excited about the Kings' depth, it's not because I believe the Sacramento Kings would be okay if they lose one of their top dogs. Like, it's a cliche, De'Aaron Fox being the head of the snake, or the Kings are only going to go as far as De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis take them. It's oversaid, but it's true. Right? And I don't think that's not a hot take. That's not a revelation that should blow your mind. Like, we know, as good as the supporting cast is that the Kings have built around Fox and Sabonis, as important that's going to be for their game and their success this season, I believe you still need the two of them to carry you into that playoff spot. And even if Davion plays as well as he did at the end of last season as a starter, even if Domantas Sabonis gets back to his all-star ways, putting up those all-star numbers that he was putting up in the Eastern Conference, which, by the way, I think StatMuse put this out. Domantas Sabonis' numbers, like, the only big that was putting up numbers similar to Domantas Sabonis was the league MVP in Nikola Jokic. That's how good Sabonis is. Like, people forget how freaking good Domantas Sabonis is, and he's going to prove a lot of people wrong and remind a lot of people, I think, in Sacramento, when paired with a point guard like De'Aaron Fox, that he's never played with in his career to this point. And Fox, of course, has never played with a big like Sabonis to this point. I think the two are going to be perfect for one another in so many ways. But the Kings are going to need 70-plus games out of that too, those two. They're going to need it. And De'Aaron consistently has gone down through stretches in his career. Sabonis played only a handful of games at the end of last season with his own kind of injury bugs and things like that. Of course, the Kings kind of shut both of them down and erred on the side of caution when last season was a lost season at the end of the year. But the Kings need 70-plus games out of those two, maybe even 75-plus if they want a chance of actually making the playoffs. But if there's a night or two when you need to rest them, or that they're out because they're a little banged up. And believe me, De'Aaron Fox is going to be banged up because of how hard he plays, how downhill he plays. De'Aaron has played through injury every single season of his career. Every single season he's played through injuries. He's had to. The Kings have, I think, enough depth to survive those games, survive those nights, and to maybe even excel on nights where De'Aaron and Sabonis are struggling a little bit. I said this before and I'll say it again. The Kings couldn't get away with De'Aaron Fox having a bad night or just an average, fair night the last couple of seasons. I think every once in a while they'll now be able to get away with that because of their depth. The Cleveland Cavaliers have acquired Donovan Mitchell. And they, I think, fleeced the Utah Jazz, even though the Jazz now have a boatload of picks because of that trade and the Rudy Gobert trade. I'll share with you what I feel this means for the Sacramento Kings before we wrap up today's podcast. Here's what I'll say about the Donovan Mitchell trade. Congratulations, Cleveland. That team is going to be so much fun to watch. Thank goodness Donovan is going east and not staying in the West. The Utah Jazz have completely blown it up. I feel bad for Mike Conley. He's still there, although I think Bryant West was saying online, and he's absolutely right. Like, Mike Conley probably is going to L.A. or probably is going to go to a Dallas or some kind of team that is going to use his skills here at the end of his career. I think he's paid $26 or $27 million this year and like $28 the following year. I think it's a player option. I'm not entirely sure. Conley's being paid a lot of money, and he's at the end of his career, and poor guy is just sitting at a wasteland in Utah looking around going, what the hell just happened? So the Utah Jazz are tanking. They're one of 4 teams in the West that are going to be abysmal, in my opinion. Jazz, Thunder, especially now that they lost Chet Holmgren, Rockets, who are just going to be young and trying to figure it out, and San Antonio Spurs. That means that the Sacramento Kings have to beat one team in the West other than those 4 to be a play-in team. You would think that as a host of the Locked On Kings podcast, as someone who has covered the Kings for the last 6-7 seasons, as someone who has grown up watching the Kings and has spent basically their entire life following the Sacramento Kings, you would think I would know better as to say that I can't fathom the Kings missing the play-in. You'd think I would know better, right? But I genuinely cannot fathom it. Like, I cannot fathom the Kings not being at least 10th best in the West. That's such a freaking low bar. 10th best in the Western Conference. Better than one more team and 4 tanking teams. I don't know who that one team is. Maybe it's Portland. Maybe it's the Lakers. No idea who that team is. But the Kings, they have to be 10th best. This roster has to be 10th best at minimum in the Western Conference. If this Kings team doesn't make the play-in, my brain will explode. Like, I don't know. Maybe I'll do some kind of forfeit. I have no idea. But I cannot fathom the idea of the Kings not being in the play-in, not having the 10th best minimum roster and team in the Western Conference. Can't fathom it. And again, maybe I'm dumb for having that perspective as someone who has covered and followed the Kings for my entire professional career and even my fandom as a young fan before that. I've followed this team every single year during this 16-season playoff drought. You'd think after 16 seasons, maybe I'd know better. I genuinely don't or cannot wrap my brain around this team not at least being 10th best. Am I crazy for that? I don't think I am. I really don't think I am. I don't think that's too much that's not too much to ask this roster. That's not too high of a bar. Like, if the Kings are 11th best in the West, if the Kings don't make the play in this year, barring catastrophic injury, like, heads are rolling. There's going to be a serious issue here in Sacramento if they can't figure that out at the very least, especially with how bad those bottom 4 teams in the West are more than likely going to be. Let me know your thoughts on that, your thoughts on the Donovan Mitchell trade, your thoughts on this Kings bench and their bench depth. Do you agree with me having them right in the middle? Do you think the bench is better than I'm saying, worse than I'm saying? Let me know. At MattGeorgeSack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. Leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. I have a lot of great guests coming up here on the Locked On Kings podcast. Like I mentioned, the series that I'm going to be doing with Brendan Nunez coming up shortly. I'm working on getting Scott Moak, the Kings PA announcer. You'll hear his voice at the beginning of every Kings podcast. He's going to join me, and we're going to talk about just his time as the PA announcer. He's going to tell some stories, and we're going to talk about this upcoming season, what to expect inside the Golden One Center. I'm going to be joined, hopefully, by a couple of other exciting guests. I don't want to share yet because we haven't gotten it confirmed, but some that are in this community. I'm working on a really big guest who is from the Sacramento area, who's a diehard Kings fan, grew up a diehard Kings fan, even though he's known in another professional sport. That's all I'll say. I'm working on great guests here coming up to wrap up this offseason as we get into training camp and the start of next season in October. I'm very excited about that. Thank you so much for your support. Can't wait to have you join me on the next episode of Locked On Kings. Until then, my name is Matt George. You've been listening to the Locked On Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.